If you learned Genesis 6 as a story about giants, you may have been handed the second mystery first. The harder question comes one line earlier, in 3 Hebrew words, bene ha, usually translated sons of God. In the American Standard Version, Genesis says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair." Then, almost immediately, it says, "the were in the earth in those days." Those verses come to us in the medieval Masoretic Hebrew tradition, preserved in manuscripts such as the Leningrad Codex, B19a, copied in Cairo in 1008 or 1009. But the puzzle is much older than that codex. If the sons of God are heavenly beings, Genesis 6 hints at a boundary-breaking rebellion before the flood. If they are human rulers or the line of Seth, the warning is different. The question is not whether the passage is strange. It is what kind of strange Genesis actually gives us. Online, this is often called proof of ancient giants, aliens, and forbidden history. But that phrase hides a more complicated story. Genesis 6, 1-4 is only 4 verses. It does not mention UFOs. It does not describe extraterrestrial bloodlines. It does not point to a museum basement full of verified giant skeletons. What it says is much more restrained, and in some ways more unsettling. The were in the earth in those days, and also after that. That is Genesis 6:4 in the American Standard Version. The word appears only one other time in the Hebrew Bible, in Numbers 13:33, when Israel's spies report seeing the sons of Enoch in Canaan. That is all the Canon gives us by name. So the task is not to flatten the mystery. It is to keep the mystery where the text actually places it. Genesis places this scene just before the flood. Humanity is multiplying. The violence that will soon fill the earth is gathering. And into that setting comes the phrase, bene ha. In the Hebrew Bible's ancient world, that phrase naturally evokes heavenly court language. In Job 1:6, the ASV says, "The sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah." The same kind of scene appears again in Job 2:1, and Job 38:7 speaks of the sons of God shouting for joy at creation. That does not end the debate, but it explains why many ancient readers heard Genesis 6 as a story involving heavenly beings. The wider ancient Near Eastern world had similar divine council language. At Ugarit, in ancient Syria, texts use expressions such as bien il, sons of El, for divine beings in a heavenly assembly. Later, Jewish and Christian interpreters did not all follow that path. Some read the sons of God as human rulers, men with royal power who took whatever women they chose. Others read them as descendants of Seth, intermarrying with the line of Cain. Julius Africanus is often associated with an early human line reading, and Augustine later helped make the Sethite interpretation influential in the Latin West, especially in City of God, 1523. So even before we reach, the question is already divided. Heavenly rebellion, royal abuse, or covenant line corruption. Later tradition expands the story most dramatically in First, especially the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1-36. This is not Genesis repeated. It is Genesis interpreted. First is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic work, probably composed in Aramaic in stages during the Second Temple period. The Book of the Watchers is commonly placed in the 3rd century before Christ. In that work, the spare phrase, sons of God, becomes a named rebellion of watchers, heavenly beings who descend, desire human women, and produce giants. In R. H. Charles's translation, 1 Maud 6:2 says, "The angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them." Matters here. Cave 4 yielded Aramaic manuscripts, including 4Q201, 4Q202, 4Q204, 4Q205, 4Q206, 4Q207, and 4Q212, now associated with the Israel Antiquities Authority and the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library. Henrik Dronel's 2019 Oxford edition treats these 7 Aramaic manuscripts in detail, overlapping parts of the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Dreams, and the Letter of. Broader counts often speak of 11 Aramaic first manuscripts from. This does not mean the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve a complete book of. They do not. The material is fragmentary. Greek fragments also survive, including material from Akhmim, sometimes associated with Codex Panopolitanus, and Chester Beatty, Michigan papyrus leaves for later Enochic chapters. The only complete textual tradition is Ge'ez, preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts and in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo biblical tradition. And one more caution matters. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve Genesis fragments too, but 6Q1 Paleogenesis preserves Genesis 6:13-21, not Genesis 6:1-4. So confirms ancient Genesis transmission and ancient Enochic interpretation. But it does not give us a copy of the exact sons of God sentence. What the text itself says is brief. Genesis 6 begins with human multiplication. Daughters are born to humankind. Then comes the sentence at the center of the debate. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all that they chose. The language is compressed. It does not name angels. It does not name demons. It does not explain the mechanics of the union. It simply says that the sons of God saw, took, and chose. Then Genesis chapter 6:3 gives the divine response. My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for that he also is flesh. Human days are limited. Judgment is drawing near. Hold on to that restraint. Most of what people argue about comes from the silence between the sentences. Verse 4 then says, There were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The verse ends, These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. That final line matters. Genesis calls them mighty men, men of renown. The ancient Greek translation tradition of Genesis uses gigantes, the word from which English gets giants. But in ancient usage, giants may suggest more than height. It can point to violent warriors, legendary heroes, or ancient peoples remembered with dread. Genesis never gives the Nephilim's height. It never describes bones. It never says the word means fallen angels. The term's meaning remains debated, and Genesis applies it to a group on earth. This is where legend usually outruns the verse. Numbers 13:33 is the second and only other Hebrew Bible occurrence. In the spy report from Canon, the scouts say, There we saw the sons of Anak. The report is fearful, and it is part of a larger scene about Israel's unbelief at the edge of the land. It shows that language survived in Israel's memory as a way of speaking about terrifying pre-Israelite peoples. But it does not solve Genesis 6 by itself. First, gives a much fuller answer. In the Book of the Watchers, the heavenly beings are angels who rebel. Their children are giants. Violence fills the earth. Later, 1:15:8 says, "The giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth." That is a profound interpretation. It shaped Jewish and Christian imagination for centuries. Scholars such as Loren T. Stockenbrook and Annette Yoshiko Reed have shown how important Enochic traditions became for early Jewish demonology, fallen angel traditions, and later Christian reception. But it is still an expansion. First tells us how some Second Temple Jews understood Genesis 6. It does not turn every detail into the wording of Genesis. There is one line in Genesis 6 that keeps interpreters cautious: "the were in the earth in those days, and also after that." Are they the offspring of the union? Many readers, ancient and modern, have thought so. The flow of the passage seems to connect them. But the wording also allows another possibility, that they were present in that age and the children of the union were remembered among the mighty men of old. J.J.T. Dodens' work on Genesis 6:1-4 and discussions by scholars such as John Day and Ki-Un Jung show that the relationship between the union, the and the later Numbers story remains debated. So the most careful reading says this: Genesis gives a boundary-crossing story before the flood. It speaks of the sons of God, the daughters of men, a divine limit on human life, and the presence of it gives enough to warn. It does not give enough to satisfy every later curiosity. First had influence. That is not in dispute. It was valued in some Second Temple Jewish circles. It was copied it was known among early Christians. The New Testament letter of Jude is the clearest case. Jude 14 says in the King James Version, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." That closely parallels 1:19. Jude 6 also appears to assume a tradition of rebellious angels, though interpreters debate exactly how direct that connection is. But influence is not the same thing as canon everywhere. Genesis was received in the Torah, and it stands in Jewish, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox traditions. First followed a different path. It was not received into the rabbinic Jewish Tanakh. It was not included in most Christian Old Testament canons. Athanasius's 39th Festal Letter in 367 lists Genesis but not. The North African Councils of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 likewise preserve Western canonical lists without. This was not a decision at Ea, and it was not a single universal Bible from which was simply removed. Canon histories developed differently in different communities. The major exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, whose official list gives 81 books and includes and among Old Testament books. The Eritrean Orthodox tradition preserves the same broader inheritance. According to the Ethiopian tradition, is not merely an interesting ancient book. It is scripture. So what does Genesis 6 actually mean? The oldest contextual reading, in my judgment, favors heavenly beings. Job's use of sons of God, the ancient divine council background, and the early Enochic interpretation all point in that direction. Many early Jewish and early Christian readers heard the passage that way, but a reverent reading should not pretend the debate is over. The royal ruler view takes seriously the language of power and abuse. They took them wives of all that they chose. The Sethite reading takes seriously the moral collapse of the generations before the flood. These are not internet inventions. They are serious attempts to read a difficult text within Scripture's larger story. John J. Collins, James C., Annette Yoshiko Reed, Lauren Stuckenbrook, George Nicholsberg, and others have shown how rich and complicated the Second Temple evidence is. Henrik Drahnel's work on the Aramaic manuscripts reminds us that the Watcher's tradition is ancient, fragmentary, and historically important. The responsible answer is therefore not a slogan. Genesis is brief, is expansive. Later canon history is diverse. The passage most likely remembers a heavenly boundary crossed before judgment. But Genesis itself speaks with deliberate restraint. Genesis 6 is mysterious not because Scripture is careless, but because it gives just enough light to show a broken boundary before the waters rise. My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for that he also is flesh. What survives here is a warning in miniature. Preserved in Genesis, expanded in guarded in Ethiopia, and debated wherever readers still pause over those 3 Hebrew words. There are many more places where the Bible's edge meets the literature around it. Caves near, gaze codices, Greek fragments, and canon lists written in careful ink. If that world draws you in, subscribe to the Apocryphon Scripture, and we will keep reading the old witnesses slowly.